in 2020, Power to the Pixel. My name is Natalie Baneng and I'm the Fagugesi online host. And today we bring you yet another panel. And on today's panel, the topic is digital transformation and cultural heritage in the global south. So, this is the very last of the heritage and technology panel, and we've had about five, a series of five at the Fagogesi Festival this year. We are delighted that the Goethe-Institut in Johannesburg has joined forces with those in Brazil, India, and Indonesia to bring us this fully global South conversation on digital transformation and cultural heritage in the global South. The panel has been developed in extension to the Hack Your Culture project taking place internationally and organized both locally between Goethe-Institut and Credible. So I'm going to introduce everybody to our panel chair, I hope I don't pronounce your name wrong, but Medhavi Gandhi, and she is from the Heritage Lab in Indonesia. Welcome, and may everybody who's here please use the chat and the Q&A section to ask any of your questions. And please be aware that we do have people from all places in the world, and we have interpretation. So if you need to hear what people are saying in other countries, may you please make use of the interpretation function to hear what they're saying. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to the chair of this panel. I'm so sorry I said your name wrong. May you please help me?
No, not at all, Natalie. This is perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and welcoming all of you to today's panel discussion, which, as Natalie mentioned, is about digital transformation and cultural heritage in the global south. We'll be focusing on why it is so important for cultural institutions to make their archives and collections accessible and participate in processes of sharing and collective co creation. My name is Medhavi, as you just heard. I'm from India, though not from Indonesia, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Joining me on this panel are some wonderful speakers from Indonesia, Kenya, and Brazil, and it's a pleasure to be introducing all of them to you before we sort of just get into a discussion. So I'm just going to start with introducing everybody. Um, so our first speaker, Dr. Lisistrata Lusandiana, who has been the executive director of the Indonesian Visual Arts Archive since 2018. She was the head of the Indonesian Visual Arts Archive program in 2016 and the director of the Archives Festival in 2017. She's been involved as a researcher and assistant curator in the 2015 Biennale Yoga called Hacking Conflict, and was the coordinator of the Biennale Forum Age of Hope in 2017. She also writes for cultural art magazines. She's the editor of Mata Jendela magazine and is involved in several exhibitions as well as art and research projects. She has a master's in religious and cultural sciences from Sanata Dharma University, Yogyakarta, with a thesis on backpacker ethnography, a critical study of community mobility and cosmopolitanism. She is currently developing programs related to decolonization, and we are going to speak about that, and a culture of documentation. So, welcome, Lisistrata, and we are hoping to engage further with you. Our second speaker is Dr. Njoki Ngumi from the Nest Collective in Kenya. She's a writer, an artist, and a feminist thinker who has held positions in private and public healthcare sectors in Kenya. As a Nest founding member, she has been a co writer, screenwriter, a script supervisor for all of Nest's film works, and is currently expanding her filmmaking practice as a co director of The Feminine and the Foreign. Her keen eyes and ears are a critical component of the collective's post production processes and as well as its strategic and research outputs. In addition, she coordinates the Nest's external collaborative projects and serves as programs and strategy lead at the sister company Heva. So, welcome, Dr. Njoki Ngumi. Uh, we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts and views on the digital transformation processes and the climate in Kenya. I'm also very excited to welcome Dr. Cristiana Serejo, who's the Deputy Director of the National Museum of uh, the Rio de Janeiro Museum of the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. She's the head of the collections committee of the museum as well. My apologies for this mixed up introduction. She is also a current associate professor at the National Museum. And as a researcher, she works with evolution and systematics of the crustacea and supervises the master's and PhD students in zoology graduate programs at the museum as well. She's also a fellow of the Brazilian Crustacean Society and associate editor of Nauplius Journal. Internationally, she acts as an editor of some groups within the order Amphipoda from the World Register of Marine Species. Wow. So I'm really excited to welcome all of you. So much to learn from each other. And so, yeah, I guess welcome. And now that everybody's video is on and we can all see each other. Um, so we've been discussing digital transformation, and I just like, especially during this pandemic, it's really accelerated all over the world. So I want to get started with asking you, what have been some of the most positive digital advancements or innovations to have emerged in the cultural sector of your country, of your region during this time? And feel free to jump in. We're not following a particular order. It'll be great to have everyone's contributions. So, uh, uh, whoever wants to go first, maybe Lisistrata, do you want to go first?
Okay, thank you, Medhavi.
Sure.
It's an honor to be here. My pleasure. Well, yeah, pandemic has indeed played its role as a game changer. Like, um, like what you said before, that it brings acceleration in our digital culture. And during this pandemic, everybody is challenged to have strategy in continuing and running the programs as cultural institution as well. And before the pandemic, we have to adapt with this digital transformation, but this pandemic has fastened, accelerated the process. And at some points, digital media is a solution in order to be able to communicate during physical distancing. And fortunately, what we've been doing with IFAA, we already started to digitize our collections, our analog collections since years ago, like more or less. We started in 2007, and since then we've been also trying to develop a digital archive platform to give wider access to the public worldwide. And we've also been working with several cultural organizations to develop Indonesian cultural archive network. And we collaboratively with other cultural organizations develop skills of digitation, develop other programs to activate our collections. Well, basically, yeah, the pandemic has reminded us that digital transformation is a solution, but it's still challenging in terms of infrastructure situation, in which one of the tasks of IFAA is data capturing. So before the pandemic, we went to cultural events directly and recorded the works of art and recorded the situation of the event on the spot, on ground. But yeah, we have to create a strategy in which, in this situation, in this physical distancing situation, and when we were hit by the pandemic, in the first few weeks, there were no cultural event taking place. Like everybody were staying at home, and as the time goes, we're forced to have strategy to cope with the situation. And few months later, there were many initiations started, and it has also reminded us that creating events online could be much more affordable, and at some points could be easier and faster. And it also reminds us that sometimes we waste too much time and energy to travel for having discussion or for having conferences. Well, it can be done like this. I mean, it's probably much affordable, and well, yeah, sometimes uh, it's a solution, and it has opened many possibilities that probably we didn't really think before. Thank you.
To Christiana, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Uh, well, it is a challenging time for sure, because no one was expecting to be locked down inside their homes, and but all these difficulties, situations gives opportunities for us to grow, in different levels. So I think in the digital, of course, now it's really strong because we need to communicate in a digital way. And as Listrata said, is an opportunity, and of course is much more affordable. On the other hand, we got many courses happening down here in Brazil, many conferences. We actually had a conference that was meant to happen that didn't happen, but we managed to do it online. So it's really interesting because it's important for us to communicate, and it is more affordable. So I think the information go fast in this way, and of course we never go back in the way before, because you're going to use it much more, this connection between people around the world. So we are doing this right now. It's just amazing how we can be together, and it's so cheap and easy to do it. And so that's really interesting. Of course, there is the challenge of being prepared. So in the museum we did in June was the 202-year anniversary. And of course, the researchers wasn't prepared for such a thing, but they do, YouTube videos, a little, little classes for, just to show to people what you're doing, what our research. So was really a challenge because no one was really preparing and know how to do it, editing videos. So we needed to be more maybe professional with that, so we can use digital way to do in a proper way, in a beautiful way. And so that I think that's the challenge. But I think we are not going back for the pre-pandemic time. So I think we gain a lot in this situation. So that's what I think. Thank you.
Right. That's interesting what you say about the challenges, and we'll come to that. But before that, Dr. Njoki, what have been the opportunities that you have seen, and what have been some of the positives for you that have emerged?
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to listen to Lisistrata and Cristiana. And I just kind of want to riff off something that Cristiana said, which was around the idea of solidarity. There's been a way that we've learned how to exist in parallel in the digital space. And that means all of us are just kind of talking about our own little experiences in our own little corners. And we're not necessarily interacting. But then one of the things that the lockdown did bring, and again, one must recognize that digital access is not universal. It should be, but it is not. And so this is a thing that especially cultural service providers and people who work in culture really, really have to also go into the fact that the idea that access to the internet should be, if it is not already defined, so a universal human right. I do think that the idea around solidarity really enabled us to kind of be more intentional about finding ways to be present to one another and to each other's experiences, to listen a little bit more to one another. One of the trends that we enjoyed most as members of the Nest Collective who work on the project that's called the International Inventories Program, which is figuring out multiple things around objects, Kenyan objects in museums abroad, was the museums at home trend. So definitely there was a whole bunch of people who were like, the public can't come to the museums, but then what interesting things can the museums and the art galleries and what have been called the glam institutions, what interesting things can they show to people at home? We even saw theatres such as the National Theatre in London being able to beam whole plays that people would previously have to buy a ticket and go to. But then now they were able to put these plays up on YouTube for brief periods of time. And so each week there was a new play and there was a lot of excitement around which play would come up every week. So there was lots and lots of interesting things around people reaching back into their archives to see what they would share with the public. And it was a beautiful, beautiful time of being able to share and just kind of engage with all kinds of, a lot of free content. And that really speaks to the ways in which the cultural sector really stepped up to be able to provide solace, care, a bit of escape, and all sorts of different ways for people to engage emotionally with what was and continues to be a deeply confusing time. I think going forward, we're really going to have to rethink the idea of memberships that are limited by the idea of the physical border. I think, for instance, that if you're thinking about places like the National Theatre, it's very easy for them to have a membership that surpasses the UK. It's very, very easy for them to have members from all across the world who are interested in watching the kind of content that they have without necessarily having to leave their country to be able to go and watch these plays. I think it's really going to be interesting to see what people are able to do with virtual, with augmented realities, with mixed realities, especially as these things move from being a very solitary experience to being a much wider one, and to see whether it's possible for multiple people at once to share an experience, even when they're not necessarily in the same place. Very, very much like the Matrix, but also, I mean, in a more serious note, finding ways for people to be present together in the same way that we're here present on this Zoom call. How can this be a little bit more augmented? How can this be a little bit more of a 3D, holistic, more sensual experience where we are seeing beautiful things, we're engaging with beautiful things, we're really, really diving into the idea of story. There's a wonderful tech, and I guess this will be my last point. There's a wonderful tech entity in Kenya called Nendo. They do a lot of research and things, and one of their favorite things to say is about how in Kenya the main uses of the internet are the 5 S's, and the 5 S's are search, sports, sex, social, and stories. I do want to focus on the idea of the story, and because with the story they really focused on platforms like Instagram, Reels, Live, and definitely YouTube for video streaming. I think that there's going to be more and more ways that we can really be able to use some of these platforms as cultural institutions to kind of go into people's recreational space, as opposed to seeing the work that we do that's it's work, and especially for us in the space, it's definitely our work, but we want it to feel recreational for people. We want people to be able to come to us when they're resting, not necessarily when they're only teaching or when they're passing on important homework like information. We want people to be able to come to us for fun as well. And so I think finding interesting ways to tell stories and interesting ways to be social is really going to be super important going forward.
Thanks for that. And I think I completely agree with the 5 S's that you pointed out. It's largely similar in India as well. What I understand from what all three of you have shared has also been that in this time we've seen a lot of content being generated and shared across. And Dr. Njoki, like you pointed out, that there have been the hashtag trend of museum from home and plays and so much that has come out. So it sort of puts a sort of pressure on a glam institution's staff to come up with this constantly, especially during this time, to sort of especially for small teams that are, I mean, museums especially that are understaffed, to constantly create something. And that has been a challenge, I think, in India as well, where small museums have felt, oh my God, so much is happening all over. And what are we going to do? And can we even do this every day? And the kind of activities you've mentioned, that on reels things have happened, institutions might have signed up on these platforms as well. So I mean, do you think going forward also, like Dr. Christiana mentioned, that we're not going to go back from here anymore, but in the way forward, what are the challenges? Like, is this going to be sustainable? Is this going to be doable? How are we going to sort of go, beyond this? How are we going to manage through this?
I mean, let me just kind of jump in. And I think it's a really, really exciting time. I think, first of all, the work and job landscape is changing radically. Many would say for the worse, because people don't have the kind of job securities that they used to. You don't go to a job and get the kind of perks that people were used to before. There's so much more work being done by people as consultants. So it's been kind of distilled to, you come and do your deliverable and charge me an amount that means that you can take care of yourself. And sometimes that amount is not even necessarily guaranteed. So there's many arguments to be had. And of course, you can see the way this conversation is panning out with the ways in which Uber and governments and labor unions and gatherings are having some really, really deep and very, very important conversations as regards what the future of work looks like. That being said, there's a whole bunch of, I don't think small institutions need to take on the entire pressure of doing some of these things. There's so many people that are doing remote work from home, etc., that would be really willing to come in and do all sorts of trainings, whether it's a training of the existing staff, whether it's being able to take this job as a contract and do maybe twice weekly posts or things like that, to ask people, help people figure out who exactly are your digital audience, or who do you want to be your digital audience, and then how do you reach out to these people in this space? How do you grow an audience that's interested and engaged? How do you reach out to these audiences without necessarily needing them to come to you? How do you attract even an international audience? How do you frame even your coming exhibitions and things like that to attract people who are thinking about the space from very far? Sometimes it's not even terribly far like another country. It's very far like the next town, where it would probably be an hour or so to drive, but then in their regular life, this person would never come your way, but then you're still interesting to them because you're just an hour away. So you're far, but again, you're not too far. So I think there's a lot of people, and not necessarily just young people, because one of the things that people really love saying is how, oh, young people, the internet, it's not necessarily true. Because the internet, there's so many people who have been able to figure out ways to learn. There's a lot of even free online courses or relatively affordable ones that GLAM institution staff and personnel can take on platforms such as Domestika, which do all sorts of interesting and beautiful courses that then somebody can take and say, let me figure out Instagram. So instead of thinking about the whole big digital space as this juggernaut mountain that I'll, why don't I just pick one thing and start there? So especially with a museum, which can be a very visual space, then you say, okay, fine, let me figure out Instagram and see how that would work. Or maybe there's somebody who just really likes having fun. So it's like, maybe TikTok would be fun for that, things like that. And so just taking one small step, whether it be learning something new or inviting somebody new, because the space is a new one. And so in order to engage in a new space, we have to do things in slightly different ways than we did before.
Shall I go and speak a little bit? Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think that there is, of course, many challenges on the digital, world. And of course, TI structure is the first one, because not everybody got really a good internet. Even at our museum, we are still struggling to have a really fast internet. So the basic. So I think we need to invest a lot in the structure of TI. And Of course, we got now a lot of offerings, a lot of courses, a lot of free, media. So it would be nice to do good things, to, approach people. And of course, as a natural history museum and anthropology museum, we got a lot of, information on these fields. So it would be nice to do really nice, culture and scientific, material to really approach people, so they can really are together with our goals and understand what you're doing. Of course, the National Museum got the fire on 2018, which is a really struggle for us. So we still are doing a reconstitution of our, institution. So it's still a hard time. We play that we got, the fire and the pandemia. So it's really two big events to be, taking care of it. But you got two ways of, I mean, when we're talking about digital and the media, we got the Instagram, we got the Facebook and YouTube, which are more like to put out what you're doing away more to the society. But we also got the research information, and this part we are also taking care of it, to digitize our collections and to make it available for, more wide audience, for researchers and the governments who are taking care and deciding, environmental problems, biodiversity, challenges, um, climate change. So we got this more media, interface, which is for more general people, but we also working on to bring, scientific information to a wide audience. So it's a huge challenge, but we needed to really be organized. We are working on our collection policy now. We also working in our museum planning. So just to restructure all our thinking and goals, and of course, digital are part of our, enhancement and for the future. So we are putting this in a top agenda to really reconstruct and be an up-to-date museum. Of course, that's I think the actual language. We needed to be prepared to communicate and bring information for people, so they can really be together with us and vote on museums, and so that people can afford and put money. I mean, the government, of course. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the challenge that you've been working with, because I was honestly very curious that, we heard about the fire, and that was quite disastrous. And post that, the sudden move to digital, and it has actually sparked a discussion on the need for digital in museums even more strongly, actually. So I'm really glad that you addressed that. Thank you. Um, Lisistrata, what do you feel about the kind of challenges that we are going to be faced going forward, or you've sort of faced during this time itself?
Yeah, it is still a hard time. It's still challenging, considering that the digital advancement, the infrastructure, in terms of the infrastructure, is still there is still huge gap. Like from in many regions, the condition is different from one another. What we've been trying to figure out, what we've been trying to do in the city that I live, for the example, for like I live in Jogja, there are many events held annually. Like in 1 month, we can go to many events, cultural events. What we've been doing so far is it's probably a good time to re-evaluating what engagement is. What what's the meaning of public for institutions like GLAM institutions? For the example, like if we have to, for some people, like online museum or online exhibition doesn't really, well, of course, it brings different uh, um, impression for those who wants to appreciate the works of art, or because in the exhibition it's not only the works to be exhibited, but there is also conversations among people, the meeting among people, and the liveness of this meeting, the liveness is irreplaceable. But we've been trying to reevaluate what engagement is by making kind of limitation of the audiences in each day or each sessions of the day. So we kind of make a list of the public to be the target audiences that as priority of audiences, so that we give them invitation, we invite them and put them in priority. For the example, if we create exhibitions that is targeted to kindergarten teacher, for the example, then we invited them specifically to come and to have maybe site specific teaching, or yeah, since we have limitations in terms of the public who can come to appreciate, for the example, events or museum. So we have to be really careful with that and make kind of targeted audiences. That's one of the strategy outside digital solution that probably I can also share in here.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Lisistrata, for sharing. You mentioned that there is the challenge of digital infrastructure. Dr. Cristiana mentioned that they've been opening archives to people and working their way around that. And Dr. Njoki sort of mentioned the gap, the digital skills gap, and how GLAM professionals can be supported through various ways on building digital skills. So let me ask you all individually to rate these three things in order of importance, one being most important and three being least important at the moment, for your institution or for your region or from your country. I think it would be great to know from all perspectives that what you feel is most important or the most priority right now out of digital skills, digital infrastructure, and opening access to digital cultural heritage, enabling participation with open access archives. So, Dr. Njoki, do you want to go first on this?
Absolutely. I think I would, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. I think I would put digital skills and infrastructure as kind of feeding into one another. And then I feel as though the access to the cultural archives is almost a natural outcome from that, because the minute people begin to engage more digitally, definitely the archives will be part of it, but it'll also have room for speculation, for co-creative ways of storytelling, for deeper ways of audience engagement, and this kind of space where we diffuse the line between the expert or the academic or the curator and the audience member who's just kind of consuming a thing that has been put up for them to see. One of the things that has been so difficult, especially around museums, and that has been a really difficult thing to let go of in the wake of the coronavirus and the lockdown, has been the move towards making especially museum in exhibitions much more interactive. And one of the biggest things that, I mean, we've not necessarily even had to deal with it right now, but we'll be dealing with for quite a while after whenever this ends, is the general fear of being public in the way that we were before. You can't just go out and start touching surfaces. You can't just go out and start putting headphones on your ears and then somebody else comes and puts the headphones on their ears. Now we are really in the place of needing to sanitize everything. Before the coronavirus, like somebody could put the headphones on their ears, listen to a museum exhibit, to put it down and go, and then somebody else can come and pick it up. Now we're not in that place anymore. We can't share, even VR goggles anymore in the way that people used to be able to do it. Things have completely changed. And so the things that we had gained as regards finding new ways to exhibit things or engage beyond the subject matter in the GLAM institutions, we've had to kind of roll back on them for hygiene reasons, which is a very odd thing to be able to say. But then now figuring out ways in which these things can exist digitally. And I mean, beyond the very important work that Google has done, which is to just kind of ramp up engagement on a national level of matters of national interest. But then because things are much less national now than they are community driven because of the smaller ways in which we're having to think, I think things are going to become a little bit more nuanced, a little bit smaller, a little bit more intimate, and we could just kind of dive deeper into that than focus on huge numbers and huge gatherings. I think the value system is going to have to shift a little bit. So I would put the skills, of course, feeding the infrastructure at the top, and then whatever outputs, including access to digital archives, comes next.
Great. Okay, that's interesting and such a very in-depth sort of insight into it. Thank you, Dr. Cristiana. Do you want to go next on choosing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I think close what Jogi said. I would say, of course, digital infrastructure is just the basic, of course, and the skills. So we needed to train a lot, people to this new world. Of course, we've been using digital media for many years, but now we are forced in a fast way. Is it like a lot of pressure for you to evolve and got digital, data, which sometimes is not that fast. So we kind of got this pressure, and of course, especially in our museum, for instance, we got the natural history scientists who do basic research, but most of it, there is not really, too much skills directly to work with, programs. And so it's quite interesting to form these professional that can go between the TI and understanding what the data we are dealing with. So we are kind of training these kind of, because we needed to put this data in a digital format. We want to use patterns to get this metadata, this database. So it's quite important to train these kind of people. And there are not many outside there. So this is a quite new challenge for us. And of course, the output, I think, is in the end, because once you kind of reach the infrastructure and got skilled, people with you, the outreach it's kind of, smoothly coming out. So now we are working on a workflow of our data, especially repository, so we can have images, sounds, PDF attached with the information, and we also programming, so the information are all set. So it's quite interesting how we can evolve, and then in the end it's beautiful because we got a really nice workflow. Some museums already got that, as for instance the Natural History Museum of London that we've been working together. They already have a nice workflow, and we are reaching to that point. So I think we know where we want to end up, but we still got quite a way of doing things. But I think I would say in that direction. Yeah.
Right. That's great. Thank you for those examples. I think it's if there are people listening, they'll be taking notes on how to do this. I think that's great. Lisistrata, what about you? What would you rate in order of importance?
Well, yeah, the access would be different if there is no digital infrastructure. Well, for sure, it is like a requirement, yeah, for the open access. And I personally, as a user, I have to admit that it won't be, it will be impossible for me to graduate, for the example, from school if I cannot access many free ebooks online. That maybe the situation would be much different if I have to buy every single book that I have to read for school. So as a user, uh, for sure, it's the digital infrastructure that and digital skills that we can put as a priority. And in terms of the cultural institution, I guess sometimes if it is the digital infrastructure is still a problem in Indonesia, but we can always have a way to combine the limitation of the access, and sometimes we can always find a way to make a strategy to be able to cope with the situation and combine it with uh, engagement, another kind of engagement, for the example. Um, for the example, when we talk about the role of the museum in the third world country, in Indonesia, for the example, there is always complaints in terms of the low technology and the low digital innovation. But when we use the digital innovation as the only parameter, we will always gain complaints and pessimistic statement from the public. So I'm thinking that crafting spectatorship is also another way, which is also interesting to involve more participation.
Thank you. And I would agree. I think in India also that's pretty much, I mean, it's not expected sometimes. The general public gets very surprised if the museum seems to be high on technology or digital infrastructure. So it has been, I think the pandemic has given all museums a good opportunity to rethink their digital strategy and sort of include all these three components within it, and even think that they should have a digital strategy, starting with that. So I'm going to move on and ask. Dr. Christiana had mentioned in the beginning that there were courses that you saw as an opportunity or as an innovation that museums started doing these different courses, and there were many offerings also. But today, how to what degree do you see museums having reached new audiences in your own experience also? And how do you think digital can help museums and glam institutions reach audiences that they have never spoken to? Because we operate in that bubble of academicians and people who anyway would visit the museum or who have heard of the museum. But how do we use digital to reach those people who were probably unlikely in the first place to have heard about us or come to the museum maybe? So what has been your experience there? Have you seen a shift, or how do you plan to use digital in future? Anyone can start. It's just
I can jump in. I think the first place to use digital is by cycling back to data. What is the data telling us about our audiences? What is the data telling us about the things that our audiences are interested in? There is a kind of there's a kind of way that we inherited. It's an ethnographic way we inherited, especially for countries that have a colonial past, have inherited a way of museuming that just kind of reflects what the ways in which the colonizer used to museum vis-a-vis us thinking about how we want to present our own lives for our own reflection, insights, consumption, entertainment, enjoyment, education. right? The ways in which we want to learn about ourselves, the ways in which we want to look into ourselves, to compare ourselves with ourselves. For instance, if we wanted to do an exhibition that looks into Indonesia and Brazil and Kenya and the things that they have in common. You see what I mean? So there are ways in which I think we should hearken to our own curiosities as artists, as scholars, as researchers, as curators, as museum and glam institution personnel, as well as the curiosities of our audiences. If I go back to this list of 5 things that Nendo published that Kenyans are interested in, which tells us about our own internal curiosities, because Kenyans are always Googling things. And then there's sports, sex, social, and stories. So which museum has done an interesting sports engagement, or has looked into sports as a way of engaging the public very directly? And have they figured out a way in which you plug into the ways in which the public are using social media to then start talking about these sports? One of the biggest interplays of the digital space and sports, especially in the region that I come from, is the space of betting and sports betting. And so how would you engage with that topic from the perspective of a cultural institution, right? So the minute we start being deeply relevant to people's lived experiences is when the people will be like, oh, these people, it's like they care about who we are. They're not just coming to tell us about like a collection of random vases that they found in their store. They're very interested in who we are and what we are interested in. And so that when you've proved yourself in that way, the minute you want to start telling the public again about your vases, the public will be like, maybe these vases are interesting. Let's listen to what these people have to say, you know? So finding a way to find what we have in our stores, the data that we have in our archives, the objects, the stories, the histories that we've collected in multiple books that people have put in theses, etc., and finding ways for those to just kind of deeply engage with the public as they are now. You can do an exhibition about sex that is family friendly. It is possible. You see, so the conversation about how that is possible, and to now kind of tease the public into having a conversation about, is it possible to have, and then everybody will jump in with their opinion, and already you have a huge engagement around a thing you've not even done, right? So I really think that beginning with the data and then asking ourselves, what are people really interested in, and how can we begin to plug into that as a way of aligning our interests in our lives?
Right. I think that is just so bang on and spot on there. And I have to say, I agree with the data thing, because so far in my experience, I have not seen many museums over here in India take count of their data, not going into insights even on social media to dig deeper as to the demographics or who's coming. And these days you get all those digital ways to sort of just know that what did visitors like the most or what route they took, so you sort of know which things have been most popular, which photographs did they download from the website, or how many comments something got. I like that you mentioned the thing about data, and also the fact about what interests the audience. Sort of comes to my mind that one of my favorite museums, and sitting here in India, I can say that, is the Field Museum in the US, and how they sort of come up with, very interesting subjects like chocolate. Everybody loves chocolate. I know very few people who don't like chocolate, right? And then they go into the science of it and the history of it, and that's what is most important. But interestingly, to present their chocolate exhibition, they actually collaborated with Kraft Foods, reaching all of the people who would buy a Kraft Foods item, right? So I think those kind of collaborations are also very important to sort of focus on while talking about topics that are very important. Thank you, Dr. Njoki. I think that was really great. Cristiana, do you want to share about your experience and in reaching new audiences?
Yeah, I think 2 words on that. It's engagement, of course, and the belonging. I think you need to dispertate on people. that they belong to that, museum, the culture, especially when you're talking about the National Museum in Brazil. It's the National Museum. We are the first museum built up in Rio. We got 202 years. Of course, it was built by the colonial time. So of course, in all the different grounds, but we represent a lot of our history, our anthropology fields, and natural history, which is the biodiversity. So we are really strong on putting up the biodiversity of, the Brazilian biodiversity. So nowadays we are starting some. We need to exchange with the population for them to use, the experts. Nowadays, most of these kind of museum got something called citizen science, where people can ask questions, bring up pictures to try to understand and identify material. And this really come, people to close to the museum. So I think this partnership and trying to understand what people really want to know, it's quite interesting, and we needed to do that. Of course, there is exhibition, because we kind of burn our exhibitions. We are in a new timing of understanding how we're gonna build up our new exhibition. So we already have some planning. For instance, we're gonna build up a historical circuit, which is the front of the palace, where we have the monarch, rooms and such and such. So we're gonna have an historical part, universe and life section, cultural diversity, and the Brazilian biomes. So this is the four axes that we're gonna work with. We also did some general question to the public. So we kind of interchange with the population to try to understand what people wanted to know about the museum. So we are in this phase of reconstruction, which is it's was devastating, but it's a kind of rebuilding, and it's a kind of opportunity for us to show that we can do it in a more sustainable way, and of course connected with people wanted to hear about us. We also do taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science that describe diversity. So it's quite we wanted to explain to people what is doing, how we do that. And that's also quite interesting to put, so people can understand how important it is to invest, in this kind of science, so we can protect our fauna. And so I think all these kind of things are quite important. So the belonging and engagement is essential for nowadays, and people needed to be aware of these, things. So it's not just from above to below. We needed to do it together. That's the big thing.
I, of course, have to agree that it has to be done together. It can't be a top down or bottom up approach, either of that. And in fact, I think what you also said sort of in the beginning made me think and circle back to what Dr. Njoki said about how we museum has largely been influenced by the colonizers. Or in your, I don't know if it's true in your case, but I had an experience where I spoke to an Iranian colleague who pointed out that in India, we've not really dug deeper or come up with better research on sources that link back to Persian sources, or where the primary sources are Persian. We've not done our research. Whatever has been done by the colonizers, we largely rely on that. And I think that colleague rightly pointed it out, that even in our curation that's sort of coming in, that we haven't put in much thought or collaborated digitally perhaps to do this. I also thought when you were speaking, a thought came that, I think it also makes a difference how we meta tag, how we index all our collections, so they are more discoverable to the general public when they want to use it as a reference to ask a question, for example. So I think that discoverability and creating that is probably also going to be very crucial, and technology would play a huge role there to just understand what people are even Googling for, or trying to understand, and where is that need that we can sort of fit in and share that information. So maybe digitally listening to people is also something that I would want to focus on in our museums here, in the GLAM institutions here, and encourage that. Lisistrata, what about you? In your opinion, how does this help? How does digital help reach new audiences?
It's so helpful. I mean, our digital archive has at least shown our collections to the public. We focus on collecting contemporary art archives, and it can be used for further artistic production, knowledge production, and intercultural communication. And our online archive has been a medium that brings together communications among researchers, artists, scholars from many parts of the world, and sometimes it can bring them together. Like for the example, it connects uh, anyone who wants to have certain access of data toward someone or toward certain specific history. So it can be like connector. And I think that's also part of the, what is it, art practices as part of the intercultural communications. And yeah, I also want to highlight what have been discussed before by Cristiana and also Njoki about belonging and engagement. Um, for some communities, it is understandable that museum seems so far away. Like there is a huge gap between museum and societies. What does museum do for our life? For the example, like in our daily life, what is the significance of museum in our daily life? Sometimes I can understand what the people when they have that kind of opinion. Like it's huge and sometimes intimidating. Architecture is sometimes also not relatable with our daily life sometimes. And yeah, in Indonesia it is built by the colonizer, and we continue the method it shows that at some points I do agree that museum is mostly built for the interest of the regime, the people. And the biggest challenge, whether it is by digital media, is to distribute uh, the belonging, to distribute, to reclaim the history, to reclaim our narration. That's what I'm thinking. That is the priority, and it should be, the digital media should be used for that spirit.
I just want to say I love what Lisistrata said about distributing belonging. Because, like, if you think about, some people have too much belonging and some people have none, which is the baseline of how we describe privilege and access. And so I just wanted to say I really love that particular phrase, the idea of distributing belonging.
I agree. I
Yes.
was
I just wanted to add something just short in that situation where you're talking about kind of decolonization, also a little bit. Our ethnological, collection nearly burned it all in the fire, and our ethnologists are getting new material from the Indians here in Brazil, and they are all really keen to help rebuild the museum. So it's quite interesting how these tribes are together with the scientists to bring together, these new artifacts to rebuild the museum, as we are one of the main, researchers who studied the Indians and their language, their tribes. And so it's quite interesting how we are together with the Indians to rebuild these collections. And this is really completely different from the time of the Portuguese here around here, which was just, completely different. So we are really aware of being together with the tribes, and it's quite interesting how we are going to rebuild this history. So they're for sure feeling belonging to that, new collections and exhibitions that is coming in the future.
Right. And has there been a way of engaging them digitally, or it's a more personal engagement there, Dr. Christiana, with the community?
It's personal and digital. There is both. So there is a connection about getting the collection itself, a physical collection, and they are also working on a digital collection. So even for instance, images from Indians, the Brazilian Indians, there is abroad, we don't like to use the repatriation word, but taking the information of the Brazilians that is outside. So we do have some step in these directions in the ethnological field and also the botany fields. So we kind of bring together the information of the Brazilians that is abroad in a digital way, which is much, much easier than the piece itself. So I think digital really helps you to kind of repatriate the information, the data, and then putting together the data. It's something really important. So you can have um, information from this 19th century, 18th century, and then you can put everything together, and then the museum can be like a pole of a distribution of that information.
Right. And I think that's a very important conversation and probably an entire panel discussion in its own self, because the very objective of digital, in a way, is to erase these borders, right? These physical borders. And in that sense, how do museums, or how does digital technology help decolonize museums, or help the colonized museums, I mean, in colonized countries, erstwhile colonized countries, bring back data, like you said, and present a pool of information to um, their visitors and audiences. I think that's a direction that, and that's a conversation that is shaping up. And I'm glad that we had this in this Global South digital transformation panel discussion, because this is also a discussion that has been very tilted towards the global north in a way, that has been happening, the whole discussion about decolonizing museums. I think this voice has been so important, and the digital will have an impact moving towards a more global museum practice as well. I think that's something that remains to be seen, and maybe a time for another discussion at some point again with all of you. But for now, I think our clock has ticked, and we do not have any questions from the audience. But we do. Natalie, do we have something?
We have one
Okay.
question
Okay.
from NMM Art Museum, and they've asked, digital archives are generally accessed on screens and therefore flat. We have objects that are best viewed three-dimensionally. Have you come across good apps or tech that you use to digitize three-dimensional objects? So yeah, we just have one question, and that is the question.
Oh, I had typed my answer, and I was just saying that, like, personally and in our work as the nest, not really, because that's not really our area. We're much more media oriented. But then there's some really cool people, like the artist Melissa Alela, who is a Kenyan artist who's been working on using VR techniques to explore cultural objects. So I've put a link to where she's kind of been exploring that.
Great. Everyone has that link. I know. I think during the Hack for Glam Creative Commons Global Summit, there were 3D objects that were created. I'm not sure of the platform that was created, but the Hack for Glam platform is pretty much still there. I think I can check maybe and quickly get back while someone else tries to answer this.
Well, we had such an initiative before the fire. We had a team in the museum that was doing CT scan and on the mummies. So some of our mummies got tomography digitalized, and so we had the opportunity to do a VR, with the one of the Egypt mummies, and so we got this data, so we can do it like VR exhibitions or even models, of course 3D printing, and so luckily we did before the fire some of these images, but and it's still doing such a, but of course most of the machines burned, so we are unfortunately restructuring, but we got the skills to do it, and it's incredible because the mum is burned, and luckily we got the data to kind of show it in a way. And we did once in a, before the pandemic, we did like a VR, and we could see the mummies, and it's really exciting. I think people are really emotionally touched because the pieces doesn't exist anymore, so it's quite interesting to use that and promote that for sure.
Well, thank you, Dr. Christiana, for that. And we don't have any other questions, do we, Natalie? No. But thank you all for being such an excellent panel. This is great having this exchange with you. And I hope that this will be possible in the physical sense someday, so we can discuss this more passionately outside the conference as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for having me as well.
Thank you so much to our chair and our panelists. I think this conversation was really great and important. And thank you once again to everybody who's joined us. Thank you for coming to Fawugesi Online. Join us soon. We have so many talks, we have so many panels, so many workshops. I hope everybody has a lovely Friday, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. It was really nice to have this conversation.
Yes.
Very
I quite
necessary
like this, Natalie.
conversation.
I love it.
Oh
Thank
yes,
you.
this is the Fawugesi official
It's really
filter.
nice. You
Power
cannot
to
take
the
the eyes on you, like, kind of.
people. Thank you,
Bye
Cristiana. Thank you,
bye.
everybody.
Take
Thank you.
care.
Goodbye.
Good
Take
luck
care.
with your
Have
museums.
a good
Yeah.
weekend.
Take care.